For me, it's essential that we as individuals understand what burnout is and really understand some of the root causes. So the World Health Organization defined burnout for the first time in 2019 as a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress. And it has 3 dimensions. So as a researcher, we use these 3 dimensions to measure whether people are actually indeed in burnout. And those are exhaustion, which is basically utter depletion, just no energy, mental, emotional, often physical as well. Cynicism, which is often characterized by sort of withdrawal from your work, but also from life more broadly. You kind of pull back, partly because of lack of energy, but partly because of just disengagement, dissatisfaction with the work environment. And finally, reduced professional efficacy. You simply cannot do what you used to be able to do at the same rate or quality. And for those of us for whom our identity is quite enmeshed with our work, that one can be deeply uncomfortable to the point of terrifying, and also cause some denial behaviors when we start to get closer to burnout.
I love that you brought up the word enmeshment too. Are we going to go down that rabbit hole? Because that is a really important one. So in the physician world, physicians have always been at high risk for suicide. And suicide correlates really strongly with all of the things that we're talking about. It also correlates with attrition. And, in the US particularly, this is a huge problem because we are now at the point where 2 out of 5 physicians are looking to get out. That's a huge fraction of our practicing physicians. But the difference between the who becomes at risk for dying by suicide and who simply steps back from direct patient care and finds a different road, it all comes down to enmeshment. And so there's this beautiful article in the Harvard Business Review about what happens when you can't separate your own professional identity from your identity as a human. And I talk to, hundreds and thousands of physicians now across the US who are stepping back from direct patient care. Many of them did attempt suicide. And, what we found between the people who, nobody does it peacefully. I mean, it's a major career transition, but the ones who made it out and the ones who really, really got trapped, the difference is enmeshment, the ability to separate it and say, okay, being Dr. Wilbur is a huge part of who I am, but it is not everything that I am. I am a human first. And so I'm going to focus on my own self-preservation and figure out what I need to thrive and then take it from there at all cost. And it is going to be a high cost.
I also was thinking about the enmeshment thing because someone recently said to me, it's important to know the difference between endurance and resiliency. Endurance is when you're just exposed to the trauma over and over again, and you just get good at like kind of blocking everything out, not feeling anything, just like
and that works until it doesn't.
Yeah, which is what leads to burnout. Whereas resiliency is like we have tough times, but how are we learning and growing as a result of that? How are we improving the situation so it doesn't continue to be like that?
I think to that point, it might be helpful for people also to understand that, in very simple terms, what happens when we're in chronic stress is that our bodies get kind of stuck in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. So we're constantly perceiving a threat. Our bodies are constantly aroused in this state of, I have to deal with this stressor. And our bodies are not designed to sustain that for very long at all from an evolutionary perspective. So when we start to have that day in, day out for years, it absolutely eviscerates our physical, physiological, emotional, and I would argue spiritual well-being. It really takes its toll. And yet it's unfortunately, very normalized across many sectors and indeed society. So I think understanding that we're sort of get stuck in this, and at first it's almost addictive. You're kind of like high and wide and achieving a lot, and it feels really good. I think we've probably all been there in our early 20s, but it's simply not sustainable. We need to engage the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest. And it takes, in our current culture, that's actually a little bit countercultural, potentially counterintuitive, because we are so used to just pushing and extracting. But it is essential to having a sustainable career, to creating a sustainable workplace, is really building in time, space, and resources to be able to properly engage that component of the nervous system, which is designed to heal our bodies from the damage that stress does to it. And I'm curious, this might be a bit early in our conversation, but I'd love to kind of like, for me, when I was researching my first book, and I was like, well, what can we do as individuals? Because there's all these systems and these cultures in place. What can we do as individuals? And I came up with a framework of the 3 selves to kind of look to create that sense of resilience to what we're going through. And it starts with self-knowledge. So really knowing who we are at a really deep fundamental level. So understanding who you are as a human being, what you value, how you want your life to look and feel, what has meaning for you, really taking the time to do that evaluation. Second piece is self-awareness. So this is the ongoing practices, which might be exercise, meditation, yoga, the day-to-day that helps you stay really grounded in your body. So you are aware of the signals that your wise body, mind, and soul are sending you, and you're not overriding those, as we so often do when we're on our way to burnout. The foundational piece is self-compassion. And to me, this means it kind of goes against, it's a counterbalance to that sense of enmeshment or over-identification with our work. It's a belief that we have intrinsic deep worth just as we are, just for existing as human beings. That can take work. It's often good to do it with a coach or a therapist or however, getting that professional support can be really transformational. But then I think on this ongoing basis, allowing those three pieces to kind of guide us, it means that when we're in those situations where we're called to make decisions that maybe may cause moral injury or cause us to feel deeply out of alignment with our own values, we're clear on what they are, and we can sort of course correct and guide ourselves towards more healthy and aligned behaviors. Speaking frankly, to this day, I still make mistakes in this realm, despite talking about it every single day, all day. But it's, I think, kind of having that sort of compass together with a sense of sort of fierce. I think it takes some fierceness because it is simply so countercultural, and certainly in the healthcare profession, the legal profession, but also across many sectors, we really kind of need to take fierce ownership of our own well-being. This is, I think, sometimes a hard message to hear when you're in the middle of burnout and you're exhausted and you don't know where to start. Like my first, just reach out for help, because I think so many of us in burnout feel like we're alone or we've failed or there's some kind of something to be ashamed about inherently, even if we can't see what. But it's really through piercing through that shame or that self-doubt, reaching out to a person, whether it's a trusted friend, coach, therapist, someone, and start to talk, start to acknowledge what's going on for you so that you can start to build that change. It's an essential starting point for all of us, I think. And the sooner you take action, the less damage you're doing, and the sooner you can start that path to really healing and evolving past burnout or a close encounter with. I often get asked, like, if I'm in burnout, do I need to leave my organization? And, I think I'm really tempted all too often to kind of give probably a glib short answer, which is, get if you can get out, get out. But that's a very oversimplified answer. And for a lot of people, it's not actually feasible. So we have to think about sort of other alternatives. The kind of metaphor that a lot of people use is if you're a fish in a toxic lake, like you will take in that toxicity, and you can, as an individual, self-compassion, self-knowledge, self-awareness. But if the environment in which you're operating is simply that level of toxic, it's really hard not to burn out. So it makes it kind of a difficult one, particularly for those who are experiencing, job lock or job insecurity. Like there's these kind of or financial stress as well. There's a lot of things that sort of play into these decisions, but it is one of those things that I think, MaryAnn and I have both been through it, where your health ultimately forces you into a situation where you have to make changes. And to the extent that we can be mindful and start to course correct and, start to do some of this perhaps a little bit uncomfortable work of letting go of perhaps some of those social connections that you've sort of just realized are perhaps a bit toxic or not aligned with who you want to be. Creating that change and charting towards a life that does feel more authentic and more aligned with what matters to you can be really powerful. I've now, I've got an incredible community of people with whom I can have deep conversations, and I have a lot of, meaning in my career, and it is sort of possible, I guess, to get through that. And it's great that people working with people like you, Sophie, as well, because it means that in itself says to me that they're bringing some consciousness and intentionality to their well-being and to how they're building a sustainable career for themselves.
Yes. Well, the person I was speaking to earlier was telling me how she tried her whole life to find communities that she could fit into, but she just never found her people. She never felt like the parts of herself that she thought were great things were being appreciated by those around her. They just weren't. And so, when she found us, and then she learned that all we do is like this deep inner work and reflection and like sharing what we really feel about things and all the stuff that we weren't allowed to be when we worked for somebody else and when we were part of a system that didn't appreciate us. It just unlocks this whole world of possibilities. And it's just so Incredible. And the other thing I was going to say is, I think, MaryAnn, you said about standards and not wanting to compromise. And if you're a very type A person, you have high standards for yourself, you're ambitious, you want to achieve things, you want to do good, it's easy to apply all of that in a way that doesn't serve you or isn't sustainable. And I saw someone on LinkedIn recently say that they'd been reminded that, because they were just about to turn 30, that they still had 4 decades worth of career ahead of them. And they were like, it really put things into perspective, because things had been so crazy in the launch of her business that she got caught up in like growing and earning more and getting more clients. And then she's like, I have 40 years of this ahead of me. Like, this kind of changes everything.
Yep.
I think one of the through lines here for individuals is that there's a lot of competing priorities, and they're changing all the time. You know, someone's going to pop up and say, well, you need to do this with your YouTube channel, and you need to have a podcast, and you need to have an email list, and you need to do this. And it's so overwhelming so easily just by seeing things that's out there. And I had to come up with like a whole new way of managing my time that allowed me to be able to pivot, you know, in real time as my priorities were changing. Because if I couldn't find a way to do that, I was just getting buried in, you know, I could do this, I could do that, and I couldn't do anything because I was just paralyzed. And so I think as well, as to whether you stay in the system or leave the system, a big part of it is what you value, and if those values are shared with that organization. Because for me, autonomy is something that I value incredibly, and I could not ever get a sense of autonomy that I needed to from an employer, because I'd have to run the whole company to have that. And so I may as well start my own. Whereas other people, I think, once they get that sense of purpose that is bigger than just what their role is, they do realize that there are ways for them to live in alignment with that in their role. They just didn't know what it was, or they weren't thinking about it that way before.